Coming up, Lafayette gets his biggest command and then loses it. The biggest nose to grace the American landscape. And what Carl Ripkin, Rita Moreno, and Lafayette have in common. Welcome to Living Lafayette. From Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. And there's Tony Privatera right there, the podcast master, and in radio for 40 years, and you need to get his book. It's fascinating reading about that story, better than digging ditches, and you can get it on Amazon. And catch Tony out at Warm Springs at the Little White House and learn about everything Franklin Roosevelt. I have been reading a book by David Rubenstein called The American Experiments. Rubenstein, he was co-founder of the Carlyle Group, which was an investment organization, and now he does interviews and philanthropy. And so he's written this book, and it's really mini biographies, is what it is. And you know, biography, the reason for reading biography, there are two reasons. Number one, because it's interesting, and that includes inspiring. And second, because it's useful. You find some way that it's applicable. So he interviews people, famous people for the most part, and finds out the secret to their success. And it's interesting to me that the secrets to success come right out of Lafayette's playbook. They're Lafayettean. Look at Carl Ripkin, for instance. So he played in more games consecutively than anybody in Major League Baseball, some 2,632. He surpassed Lou Gehrig. You remember Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, 2,130.
Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
And Ripkin says that the whole idea was to be there, to be in the game, to play ball. He says the secret to his success is showing up. It's Lafayettean. Or take Rita Moreno. She was in show business for 70 years. Won an Academy Award as Anita back in 1961 in the West Side Story.
I like to be in America. Okay, by me in America. Everything free in America.
For a small fee in America.
And she says the secret to her success was perseverance. It's out of Lafayette's playbook. It's Lafayettean. Perseverance and showing up. I mean, they're synonymous. It's also interesting that Rita Moreno, she shared with Lafayette friendships outside marriage. It really wasn't unusual. That was the culture of, partially the culture of Hollywood. And of course, for Lafayette, it was French. So for Lafayette, Madame de Simeon, and for Rita Moreno, for 8 years, it was Marlon Brando. It's interesting, though, that Adrienne, Lafayette's wife, met Madame de Simeon. Liked her, even loaned her money in hard times. I don't know whether Moreno's husband of 40 years, Leonard Gordon, he was a physician, I don't know whether he ever met Marlon Brando. So, today we're talking about the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. That's sort of what's on the agenda. So it was a little interlude in events. And one person who played a major role in this was Charles Lee. Let's talk about Charles Lee just a little bit. Charles Lee, and this is Lafayette's observation, had the biggest nose Lafayette had ever seen. It was apparently prominent. When he describes it, it reminds me of those sails down on the Sydney Opera House. So it was apparently pretty major. Lee apparently was ugly. You know, there's some people that are just not good looking. Well, this is an order of magnitude different from that. So some people walk into a room and eyes just rivet because they're so good looking. So look at George Clooney or Kate Middleton. aside from their being famous, let's just really look at them. Well, apparently Charles Lee was that way at the other end of the spectrum. That he was ugly, so ugly that he attracted attention. Now, we always hear that Abraham Lincoln was ugly, but there was a poetic symmetry about Lincoln. There was some mystery about him. Charles Lee was different. He was scrawny, so not lean is one thing, svelte is one thing, scrawny is another. He tended to bathe infrequently. He did have a wit about him. He could be sort of snarky, in fact, and he preferred dogs to people. Always 5 or 6 dogs around. He was born in Britain, well educated. I mean, he could Latin, Greek, French, as well as English. And he came to America as a lieutenant in the French and Indian War. And at that time, George Washington was a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, well, likewise in the French and Indian War. They were together at the Battle of Monongahela. That was July 9th, 1755. That's when General Braddock suffered a devastating defeat, trying to capture Fort Duquesne from the French, which was about 10 miles east of Pittsburgh. Before Charles Lee returned to Britain, he married the daughter of a Mohawk chief. We don't know her name. We really don't know the aftermath of that. But we do know that the Mohawks called him Boiling Water, which gave you some idea about his temperament. So he returned to Britain only to come back to America in 1773 and stayed in America the rest of his life. About 2 years later, he bought 3,000 acres for 3,000 pounds in what is now West Virginia, close to his friend Horatio Gates. And at the end of his life, he lived there by himself with his 3 dogs, whom he mockingly called Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. He was very critical of organized religion. And in fact, he stipulated that when he was buried, he was not to be buried in a church cemetery. When Washington was named Commander-in-Chief, 1775, Lee wasn't surprised. He was known, the Continental Congress knew Lee as quite the tactician. He had a good reputation, and he was commissioned a Major General in the Continental Army. He thought he would be second in command right below Washington. He spotted Washington, the Commander-in-Chief. Washington was born in Virginia. He was American. Lee got that. But he thought he would be second in command. But Artemus Ward from New England was named second in command as Major General. So Lee was third in line. But then in 1776, Artemus Ward, for health reasons, retired. So Charles Lee stepped into that second position. So he was right below the Commander-in-Chief as Major General. Along the Hudson River, on the Manhattan side, there is Fort Washington. Over on the New Jersey side, there was Fort Constitution. Lee's reputation was such that in September of 1776, Fort Constitution was renamed Fort Lee. On November 16th that same year, 1776, there were 3,000 Continentals who were there manning Fort Washington. The British captured Fort Washington. 3,000 Continentals. Lee held Washington personally responsible for that loss, and Lee was pretty freewheeling in his opinions. He did not think highly of Washington, and he would talk to anybody about that would listen. And then, on December the 12th, 1776, Lee was in charge of men at Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Lee happened to be at White's Tavern there in Basking Ridge. The story may be apocryphal, but the story is he was engaged in some illicit activity. But besides that, he was also in the process of writing a letter to his friend Horatio Gates where he was just trashing Washington, just mouthing off on Washington and how Washington was not the best of commanders. And Lee obviously not paying attention. The British snuck up upon Lee at White's Tavern and captured him. He was well treated. He did share some data, some logistics about the Continental Army. Eventually, on April the 5th, 1778, he was paroled, which means he was released from any incarceration, but had to stay within certain boundaries. And then on May 21st, he was exchanged with Major General Richard Prescott, whom we'll see later at the Battle of Rhode Island. So, Major General Charles Lee returned to Valley Forge about the time that Lafayette returned from Barren Hill. Lafayette probably first met Lee when Washington was administering to Lee the Oath of Allegiance to the United States. Lee really didn't take that oath seriously. And you remember that oath is what Lafayette had administered. Lafayette probably administered more of those oaths than anybody else in the Continental Army. But here, Washington was administering it to Lee, and Lee did not take it seriously. That oath that he was taking was simple. I do swear that I will, to the utmost of my power, support, maintain, and defend the said United States against the said King George III, his heirs and successors. Well, Charles Lee sort of made light of it. And Lafayette and Lee differed in what they thought the capabilities were of the Continental Army. Lee thought that the Continental Army was just undisciplined and that it did not stand a chance standing up against British regulars, that they were disciplined, they knew what they were all about, and so Lee recommended that they keep their distance, that the Continental Army not engage the British regulars. Lafayette, on the other hand, had seen what the Continental Army soldiers could do, and he was in favor of their skirmishing, of their meeting. So they had a difference of opinion. About this time, the Carlisle Commission showed up. They had left Britain in April of 1778, headed by the Earl of Carlisle. And their responsibility was to try to negotiate a peace with the 13 colonies. Not outright independence. They were going to offer them a place in Parliament and self-rule, but not independence. When they left Britain in April, the Commission was aware of the Treaty of Alliance with France. They were not aware that General Howe and General Clinton had been given orders to evacuate Philadelphia, which was the capital of the 13 colonies. Had they known that, they probably would not have come, because when the British evacuated Philadelphia, then the Carlisle Commission didn't have as much leverage as it would have otherwise. They presented to the Continental Congress this idea about self-rule, about having a place in Parliament on June 13th. Continental Congress would have none of it. And Lafayette was pleased. And in fact, Lafayette wrote a letter to Henry Lawrence, who was president of the Continental Congress, applauding the fact that they wouldn't have anything to do with the Carlisle Commission and its suggestions. The Carlisle Commission and the Earl of Carlisle then tried to appeal to public opinion. And they had some not nice things to say about France. Well, Lafayette took that personally. They don't say anything disparaging about the French. So Lafayette challenged the Earl of Carlisle to a duel. Well, the Earl of Carlisle couldn't see any point in that. Lafayette, for his part, said, well, at the moment he didn't have anything better to do. So nothing really came of it, and the Earl of Carlisle and his commission returned back to Britain. Nothing came of that overture. General Henry Clinton replaced William Howe as commander of British forces in America. Lord George Germain was now the head Secretary of State of the American Department in Lord North's cabinet. And George Germain is the one who ordered Clinton to evacuate Philadelphia and to return up to New York. That was the destination. They were going to hold New York. So Clinton now, from Philadelphia, ordered men and baggage and loyalists to load up on ships and head to New York. There was a problem. There were not enough ships. So 10,000 men and baggage, 1,500 wagons. It was a train, 12 miles long. We're going to head from Philadelphia up to Sandy Hook and then on up to New York. So, 2 columns left out from Philadelphia. One went across Corals Ferry, where Camden, New Jersey now, and that was led by Knyphausen. And then the other by Clinton, and that went across Gloucester Point. And then they met at a little village of Freehold right there at Monmouth Courthouse. The 2 columns met back up. As soon as Washington saw these 2 columns evacuate Philadelphia, he sent Major General Charles Lee with 3 brigades across Corals Ferry to Dahlgren, and Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne with another 3 brigades across Corals Ferry to follow and see what they were doing, to interrupt communications if they could, skirmishing if necessary, the rear guard. On June 24th, Washington had a council of war to try to get ideas about what's the next step. Alexander Hamilton hated these things. He just thought they were a waste of time. He thought a bunch of grown men just whining around, everybody expressing a different opinion. Washington, my sense, is simply wanted to get a feel for different opinions, different perspectives. He had his own idea, of course, but he wanted to get a feel for different perspectives. It was Charles Lee who spoke up first, who said, number one, the Continentals ought to steer clear of any skirmish with British regulars. They could not stand toe-to-toe. Lafayette, on the other hand, he thought that they could stand, that they could tolerate, they hold their own in skirmishes. And furthermore, Lafayette said, we've got 10,000 British marching up to Sandy Hook. We've got a train of wagons, 1,500 wagons, 12 miles long, and we're not going to irritate them? That would be humiliating, Lafayette said. So Lee suggested a compromise. Well, why not put together just an advance guard, about 1,500 men, more or less, just a little squad, and have them just sort of irritate, just sort of fly swat Clinton's rear guard. And that's what they decided to do. And they were going to put General Scott in charge of this rear guard. Now, there were already some regiments out there trailing Clinton, and they were acting independently. So they weren't uniform in their action. So Colonel Morgan and General Maxwell, for instance, they were all acting independently. Von Steuben thought 1,500 men was not enough. If they were really going to gain a footprint, they needed more men. So von Steuben and Dubourtet, so both Frenchmen, they asked Lafayette to use his leverage, his influence with Washington, to convince Washington to generate a larger regiment to irritate Clinton's rear guard. So now the main army, the Continentals, marched to Kingston. It's commanded on the right wing, 6 brigades and 5,000 men by General Charles Lee. The left, William Alexander Lord Sterling, and he had 5 brigades, 4,000 men. And then Lafayette brought up the reserves. There were 4,000 men in 4 brigades. When they got to Kingston, Washington decided that all those disparate little elements out there, irritating Clinton's rear guard, that they needed to be uniform. Let's put them under one command. Well, Lee was the senior officer, so technically it was his right of first refusal. Lee wasn't interested in this advance guard. And besides that, in Lee's mind, he still had this idea, it's just going to be 1,500 men. It's not going to be a big deal. I don't want it. Lafayette wanted it. And in fact, Washington wanted Lafayette to have it. So Washington told Lafayette that he'd need to talk with Lee about getting it, which Lafayette did. Lee said, fine, it's yours, take it. Lafayette was thrilled. So now they began putting this new advanced guard together. So they took 1,000 men from Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne's brigade. They took Scott's brigade. You remember about 1,500 men there. Maxwell's and Morgan's men. When it was said and done, Lafayette had about 4,000 Continentals and 1,200 militia under his command. This is the biggest command he'd ever had. Well, as it turned out, word got back to Lee. This wasn't just a small force. This was a major footprint. They could do some damage with this army. And so now Lee's ego kicked in. And people pointed out to him that this is humiliating. Lafayette is his junior in rank and in experience. True, both of them major generals, but Lee was a major general first. So on June 25th, Lee asked Washington to get that command back. Now keep in mind, Lee still didn't believe that Continentals could stand toe-to-toe against regulars. And Lee was not really in favor of this advance guard at all, but his ego, he wanted it back. So he went to Washington to ask, and Washington said, well, with your permission, we'd given it to Lafayette. So Washington told Lee, you go talk with Lafayette. It's your deal. So that's what Lee did. He went and talked with Lafayette, and he used guilt. He knew how to push Lafayette's buttons. So what he told Lafayette, he said, I put my career and honor in your hands. You are too generous to ruin either one. So the main army got to Englishtown now, and on June 27th, at Englishtown, Lafayette, much as he hated to, turned over that advanced guard of nearly 6,000 men and put them under Lee's command. We're coming up on the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse now. And it is incredible when you have harmony, when all the notes are just right. I mean, it's really something in music when you get it. Take Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, Emmylou Harris, and Trio, March 1987.
Her mother smiled. She did not bring him a pearl of pardon. She brought no silver gold style.
It's something else when you see it out on the battlefield. I mean, it's chess. It's Garry Kasparov. It's the experts playing chess. Well, Lee was chief of this advance guard. But number one, he didn't have a plan. Number two, even when he did develop a plan, he didn't communicate it. He didn't let his commanders know what the plan was. Number three, he didn't keep his commander-in-chief apprised of what was going on. And whenever they communicated, it wasn't like they had cell phones. It wasn't like they could get on Facebook and communicate. I mean, he had to have runners. He had to have messengers. Well, he didn't recruit those people. And he didn't know his commanders. He didn't know about them, didn't know. Lee did not prepare for what was coming. And he was the conductor. He was part one. Well, on June 28th, this is Sunday. This is the day of the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. 4 a.m., Lafayette sent word back to Lee asking for orders. Lee ordered Lafayette to lead the advance guard out, which Lafayette did. But about a mile into leading them out, Lafayette got word from Lee to halt, not to advance. So Lafayette went back to Lee and said, what's the deal? I mean, why are we stopping? And Lee said he was concerned that the advance guard would run full throttle into Clinton and that the Continentals wouldn't be ready. Lafayette, of course, disagreed, but was willing to do whatever his commander wanted him to do. Now Clinton, on the other hand, Clinton realized now that this advance guard was coming up on the rear of his army. So he took 2,000 of his best and turned them back around to face this advance guard coming from Major General Lee and the Continentals. Well, Lee now got nervous. He thought his position was precarious, especially particular regiments like Stuart's and Wesson's. So he ordered a pullback, a, quote, retrograde maneuver, unquote. This was not a retreat. It was just a shift. Well, Lafayette looked around and saw that his supporting regiments were gone. They weren't there. And then Lafayette later said that he received an order from Lee to retreat, but Lafayette couldn't recall who brought him the order. In any event, the sort of solvent drag, when one thing starts, it cascades. So now there was Colonel Livingston and Colonel Oswald, their regiments started this retrograde maneuver. And then Mad Anthony Wayne and Scott, this retrograde maneuver began to look like a full-fledged retreat. Lee then decided he wanted to regroup his men at the little village of Freehold. And he sent Lafayette over to his right to scout it out. So Lafayette went and checked it out and saw that if they grouped there, they'd be under British fire. It wasn't going to work. Then Lee decided, well, to my left and rear, let's regroup there. Thought about it a little bit, and then Lee said, no, that's not going to work, and was trying to reestablish his lines. And Lafayette, by all accounts, was calm and professional and composed and helping to accomplish what Lee commanded. Lee had not sent word back to Washington about what was going on. And there were some soldiers who were stragglers who were falling back, and Washington ran into them. They were going the wrong way. And they gave Washington these dire reports about this retreat going on. Washington rode up to Lee, this was about noon, and chastised Lee, rebuked him, asked him why he had not attacked, and what is the meaning of this, and then took the command away from Lee. Washington took over command of the army. Sent Lee back to Englishtown just to get all the stragglers back together. And then Washington put Greene in charge of the right and put William Alexander Lord Sterling in charge of the left, and then Lafayette was in charge of the reserves. Washington here was in his element, and Lafayette watched as Washington powered up. So Washington, he ordered artillery fire, which Henry Knox directed, and then he repulsed 2 enemy charges. He drove Clinton back toward Freehold and Monmouth Courthouse. Lafayette said this about Washington: his fine carriage on horseback. Washington was apparently one of the best equestrians. I mean, he could ride a horse. His calm courage, thrown in relief by the excitement which the morning's anxiety had caused, gave him, Washington, an air well calculated to rouse enthusiasm. Nightfall came. Things stopped at nightfall. They didn't have night goggles or anything like that. Things came to a close. Washington thought that things would pick back up in the morning. For Clinton, this was all a distraction. Clinton was just trying to get back to New York. This was just interference. So at midnight, Clinton decamped and headed out, left the field. Emmanuel Lutze painted Washington rallying the troops at Monmouth in the early 1850s. This is the same Lutze who painted Washington crossing the Delaware. Lutze in 1851, which now is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, by the way. Lutze was a history painter. History painters were the epitome of the painting art at one time. And the reason is because they had to have so much talent. They had to know the history, they had to know the story, they had to be able to paint landscape, they had to be able to paint still life. All the talents that went into painting one of those, a portrait for instance, or still life or landscape, a history painter had to put them all into his work, and Lutze was one of the best. That night, Washington and Lee, they shared a military cloak. They talked of Lee. It's probably the first time Lafayette learned that Lee was freewheeling in his opinions about undermining Washington's authority. The next morning, the British had left the field. The battle was over. Typically, whoever claims the field is the victor. The British had lost 269. Americans had 249. The Americans 61. And they held the territory. Lafayette wrote Congress, changed that. Washington wrote Congress about all the bravery on the field and really lauded all his generals, not so much for Lafayette, except for his leadership of the advance guard early on. Lafayette was professional and composed, but he didn't play a major role in the battle itself. So the main army returned to Englishtown. Had Lee kept quiet, everything probably would have just sort of passed over. People would have assumed that Lee made errors in judgments, this retrograde maneuver that came looking like a retreat. But Lee could not let it go. The words, was he disobedient? Did he lack courage? He didn't attack. He let the words detonate inside him. I mean, the words themselves, I think, couldn't hurt him, but he let them. So the day after the battle, Lee wrote a blistering letter to Washington saying, number one, the only reason we won is because of my so-called retreat. That set up the win. Number two, you, Washington, have been listening to low intrigues and low gossip about me. And he also accused Washington of using very singular expressions. It's unclear whether or not Washington used curse words. There are stories that he did. But Washington wrote back to Lee, replied, saying, I didn't use very singular expressions. Lee still couldn't let it go. To Washington's one-letter reply, Lee wrote two, one of which suggested that Washington was full of himself and that he did not deserve the rebuke, and he demanded a court-martial to clear his name. Washington complied. That's not a problem. I'll be happy to help out with that. Had him incarcerated, and then he was charged with three things: disobedience to orders, dishonorable retreat, disrespect to the commander-in-chief. So, July 4th, 1778, the court-martial began. William Alexander Lord Sterling, he was the one who presided. Lafayette had to be on the stand the day after, and his story did not carry the day, but it contributed. And finally, the verdict on August the 12th, found guilty on two counts. One is disobedience to orders, and the other was disrespect to the commander-in-chief. They didn't find him guilty of dishonorable retreat. They concluded it was probably just a lack of judgment. Retreat. They suspended him from the Continental Army for a year. Lee wasn't going to have that. He resigned. And he went back to his estate, his 3,000-acre estate in what's now West Virginia. And he called it Prado Rio, by the way, which in Portuguese is stream on the meadow. He had gout, he had tuberculosis, he died. And interestingly, he was buried in Christ Church Cemetery, unmarked grave, in Philadelphia. George Moore, in 1858, was a librarian of the New York Historical Society. And in 1858, he published a paper called The Treason of Charles Lee. In it, he published a letter Lee had written on March 29, 1777. This was when Lee was incarcerated by the British. The letter was addressed to Admiral Richard Howe, Black Dick Howe, and his brother, General William Howe. And in that letter, Lee talked about how the Continentals could be beaten. Maybe we chalk this up to just aimless speculation, but Lee's reputation deteriorated after that letter surfaced. So technically, the Continental Army won the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. It raised morale. It was not a crucial battle that affected the end of the war. Lafayette carried himself well. He was composed, he was professional, but he really was not in the nexus of victory in the battle. His role was peripatetic. This is Living Lafayette, to discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.